So with that, I'm going to read her little bio that she shared. Beth St. Martin is a business owner in Millbank, South Dakota, who has lost a child to drug addiction. Her presentation will talk about addiction and the roller coaster of how addiction affects the whole family. She will share her grief path and how she endures. Her goals include helping to end the stigma of addiction and hopefully bring forth some compassion for addicts. Many of these people are victims of trusting those who are taking care of them or peer pressure. If you don't know someone already fighting addiction, there is a good chance that you or someone you love will know someone in the future that will suffer with some sort of substance use disorder. Through telling Ryan's story, she hopes to help others who may know someone who is struggling or might be traveling down the same path that her family has. I'd like to welcome Beth.
Thank you, Kelly. I'm going to try and share my screen here. I'm not very well practiced in Zoom, so we'll give it a shot here. And that rearranged my screen. Let me know if you can see. I have a South Dakota Debuts new anti-drug campaign screen up. So just when I thought that we were really starting to get a good handle and bring good awareness to drug addiction, our landscape has really changed. The coronavirus has really taken all of our attention away from what was going on. We have this state campaign that we had started, Meth, we're on it. And the tagline did bring a lot of humor to South Dakota. It gave us some national notoriety, but it did get people talking. And we also at the same time had started producing a lot of TV ads, which were great. We had recovering addicts getting on TV, telling their stories and providing hope. Well, now everything has switched to the coronavirus, and we do need to very much keep an eye on this pandemic to keep us all safe. But I would like to say, kudos to President Trump. I listened to many of his daily briefings, and he did mention on his April 2nd brief that he's not dropping the ball on fighting drugs while we concentrate on the COVID-19. In 2017, the CDC reported that there were over 70,000 drug overdose deaths that occurred in the United States. 70,000. That's 192 deaths every single day. Those are our friends. They are our sons and our daughters and sisters and brothers and family members, moms, dads. And addiction can happen to anyone. Addiction doesn't check to see whether or not you're rich or you're poor. Addiction doesn't check to see if you work hard, whether or not you come from a good family. And addiction, it's not a choice. People need to understand addiction is not a choice. You can become an addict after having surgery. You can become addicted to prescription painkillers. But there's a lot that don't. There's a lot that use drugs or alcohol recreationally, and they can't walk away from it. They become addicts. Addiction is a disease. I'd like to introduce you to my son, Ryan. Ryan was an outgoing, friendly, take care of everybody type of kid. I remember when he was only 2 years old. We lived in a duplex. He ran out the front door of the duplex, right up to a stranger on the street, and he asked them, "Can I walk with you?" He scared the daylights out of me, but he was always so friendly. And another thing about Ryan is he loved his siblings. He loved his little brother and sister. When Angie was a brand new little baby, she got fussy. So I ran into the kitchen to make her a bottle. And all of a sudden she quit fussing. And I came back into the living room, and there was Ryan sitting in the lazy boy, holding on to his baby sister. And so I took her and I laid her back down on the sofa and I said, Ryan, honey, show me how you did that. And he went over and he very gently put one hand underneath her head and the other behind her little body. And he went over and he elbow crawled his way back up into that lazy boy and got her situated and said, Mom, can I feed her? He was barely 4 years old. 1988 was a really bad year for my family. Ryan would have been just 5 years old. My dad, at 44, died of a massive heart attack. It was a complete shock and horrible. Ryan went with me and sat with me in the front row of that funeral. And he didn't understand what was going on, but he kept looking at me and holding my hand. And then he looked over and he saw my aunt crying too. And so this little child reached over and grabbed her hand. He was always, always so compassionate, so loving. Shortly after that funeral, I decided I needed to end the marriage that should have never happened. It was 3 days of guns and knives before I finally got away from my ex-husband, who told me that if he couldn't have me, nobody would. I snuck out of the house at 5 a.m. He'd finally fallen asleep. I was putting on my shoes, planning on heading to my sister's house to get some help when Ryan came out the door and looked at me and said, Mom, can I go with you? I had no idea, but this child was hiding under the dining room table. He was watching the worst of it. So at the ripe age of 5, Ryan became the man in our family. He became the one who wanted to take care of me. We went back to the cities. I was working for what was then known as Farwell, Osmond and Kirk. I set myself up so that my apartment, my daycare, and my job were all within 2 miles so that if I needed to, I could walk to work. And I would pick the kids up after daycare, and Ryan would look at me and say, Mommy, how was your day? And I'd tell him. And if it was a bad day, he would suggest, Mom, let's take the kids and go to the park so I can push them on the swing and you can have some quiet time. He tried so hard to take good care of me. He was always a loving and compassionate child. Well, the year ended well because I met my husband, Mark, in November, and we've been together ever since. I told Mark when we met, it was love me, love my 3, because to me, we were a package deal. And Mark stepped right up. He immediately stepped right up to take care of me and the kids. But Ryan really, really struggled with this because in his short life, he had seen some pretty bad things. And he didn't want anybody else to take care of his mom. He just wanted it to be us. But we worked on gaining trust. And by April of 91, Mark and I had gotten married. And in February of 92, our youngest son, Billy, was born. And we were a house full. Mark and I we were raising 4 kids. And by the time Ryan was 10 years old, he started babysitting the 2 older ones, Jamie and Angie, after school. At 14, he started delivering newspapers. When he was 15, he went to the local Perkins and filled out an application and was hired as a server. When they found out he was only 15, they fired him because you had to be 16 in Minnesota in order to have a job. But they did tell him, you come back the day you turn 16, bring your whole family, we'll have a birthday party and put you back on the schedule. And they did. He also, while in high school, started working at our local grocery store bank branch. And by the time he graduated, he was the assistant manager. He paid for almost all of his own clothes. He paid for his own haircuts. He paid for his cell phone. He paid for his car, his insurance. He maintained good grades. He wasn't always an angel, but Everybody loved him. He loved everybody. The kids he hung out with in high school, they were a little on the rowdy side and they did some partying, but we always thought it was normal partying. After graduation, he decided at the very last minute, Mom, I'm going to college. Okay. He went and applied for his own financial aid. He went to Mankato, Minnesota. He found a job right away. He worked hard at maintaining grades. He was doing wonderful. One day out of the blue, he called me and he said, Mom, can we meet at Perkins after work for coffee? And I thought to myself, you're going to drive 100 miles for coffee? So I had to call Mark at work, and Mark immediately said, so what do you think is up? And I told him, I said, Mark, we're either pregnant or gay. I think I knew subconsciously. So when we got to Perkins, we sat down and he looked me in the eye and he said, Mom, I'm gay. And I said, okay. I knew how important my reaction to him telling me, I knew how important that was to him and to his well-being. And so I quizzed him some. I asked him some really stupid questions. I asked him, are you sure? And I asked him, how do you know? And he told me, so I knew. He was so worried about telling me this that he had a bleeding ulcer. He went home that day with the weight of the world lifted from his shoulders because I made sure that he knew how much I loved him. Me, I went home and I cried. I cried for 3 days. I cried because I did not want my son to face the diversity of being gay. I cried because I was also raised in a church that told you being gay was a sin. Fortunately, at the time, I had a boss who was very much like a big brother to me, and he sat me down and he said, Beth, what has changed? And I'm glad he did that because really nothing had changed. He was still my son and I still loved him, and really nothing had changed. While Ryan was in college, he met Jeff. Mark and I got to meet Jeff one snowy night in the Twin Cities when they wrecked Ryan's car on an icy bridge. He called and told us to come pick him up, so we met Jeff. And Ryan and Jeff were perfect for each other. They were so in love. I was still struggling with this reality, but I also firmly believe that God doesn't make mistakes. We're the one that makes the mistakes. And God made my son Ryan, so therefore he's not a mistake. They ended up quitting school and moving up to the cities and getting an apartment in a high-rise in downtown Minneapolis. And they had a very passionate fire and ice relationship. I don't remember exactly when it ended, but it did end. And we didn't ask any questions. I always felt if Ryan wanted to talk about things, he would. Shortly after that, he came home one day and he told me, he says, Mom, I need a ride to the airport. And so I asked him, where are you going? He was 23 years old. He had transferred through his job at the Cheesecake Factory in the cities to the corporate headquarters in the Macy's Tower in San Francisco. He didn't have a place to live. He didn't know anybody out there, but he had a job. His motto was always, I'm not afraid. And that's kind of how he approached everything in life. He just kind of jumped right in. During the summer of 2006 is when Ryan moved to San Francisco, and that's the same summer that Mark and I moved our business from a 2-car garage in Oakdale, Minnesota, out here to a hobby farm in South Dakota. To me, it was moving home. Ryan had been in San Francisco for about 6 months when he called me one day and he told me, he said, "Mom, Jeff died." And was like, "What happened?" Well, shortly after Ryan had left Minnesota for California, Jeff had gone to the Mayo Clinic and they diagnosed him with a very rare form of bone cancer. And within 3 months, it had taken him. I asked Ryan, "Are you coming home for the funeral?" And he said, "No, I can't afford it." But 2 days later, he did call me from Minneapolis. So Mark and I went and met him at the funeral. He stayed with Jeff's family for 3 or 4 days. And they told Ryan that Jeff had asked that no one tell him about this illness because he didn't want Ryan to come back. He wanted Ryan to continue with life. Ryan was devastated. He always believed that their story wasn't over and that Jeff would come to California. So Ryan went back home. He went back to San Francisco. He had a wonderful apartment, a great job, a new car. He could afford to fly home and surprise me for birthdays. We went and stayed with him. He took me to Lake Tahoe. He decided he wanted to become a realtor, so he did that. He had a license in California. He had it all. He really, really had a wonderful life. Around 2011, and the timeline is a little blurry, I went to visit him. I drove out to Palm Springs, California. He had me meet him there. And then we went to San Diego for a week. And we stayed in a motel. We were sightseeing. We were having a good time, except for the fact that Ryan slept. For most of that entire week I was there, he slept. And I went home knowing that there was something horribly wrong with my child, but I had no idea what was wrong with him. Now, I'm telling you all of this about Ryan to help you understand what an amazing young man he really was. To help you understand that addiction truly can happen to anyone. To let you know that I, as the mom, really have no idea how it happened or when it happened. Ryan had a lot of things in his life that may have been contributing factors, but we really think that the changes happened when he got that real estate license because it was a new crowd, a different crowd, and a different kind of partying. And we recently learned that he didn't have to pay for those drugs. Ryan was the life of the party and everybody loved him and wanted him there. So they just gave him to him. Ryan and I were very close. We were best friends. He and I talked on the phone every day, sometimes more than once. And during this time frame, he really got hard to reach. He would go off grid for days at a time. So I knew something was going on, but I still didn't really fully understand. One day, the phone rang, and when we answered it, it was a stranger asking us, "Is this Ryan Cook's mom and dad?" And we said, "Yes." "Well, Ryan is in the hospital, and he's very sick." We had no way to call him because this young man had Ryan's phone. He told us that Ryan laid in his own filth for a couple of days before somebody finally called an ambulance. I honestly think that's the first time that he OD'd. I did the only thing I could. I started calling around to treatment centers. I'm in South Dakota, he's in California. I found a counselor that went and picked him up, and they drove him right to a treatment facility and checked him in. It lasted 3 days, and he walked. So I continued to research and find phone numbers and text him everything that I was finding. And I would call him and I would say, "Ryan, do you need help? And it was always, no, I don't need help. I'm fine. Memorial Day weekend, he called and he said, Mom, I need to come home. And I hoped and I prayed that this was that call. Billy was out of school. And so he and I left Sioux Falls at 2:00 Friday afternoon. We drove straight out to Bakersfield, California, turned around and drove straight home. We were home by Monday night, 8:00. And that was my introduction to a meth-induced psychosis. He would sit and stare out the window, and then he looked at me and he said, Mom, if you watch the clouds close enough, they'll turn around so you can see their faces. He asked me if I would get him a Sudoku book. He wanted to do Sudoku. So I said, sure. I stopped at a gas station, bought one. I watched him for hours filling out the ones and erasing them. I thought that he was severely brain damaged. I had no idea. He told me he couldn't go to sleep because someone was going to kill him. And then he also told me about the mirrors. There are people in the mirrors, and if you turn the lights on fast enough, you'll be able to see them. And me, I thought I could fix him. I took him to the farm. I let him sleep. I fed him. And I told him, you are not leaving this farm until you are clean. And then we'll figure out what we're going to do next. That lasted for 2 days. He came up to me and he said, Mom, I have put an ad out on Craigslist. I'm going to hitchhike back to California. And I told him, no, you're not going to hitchhike back to California. I'm not going to wonder if you're dead in the mountains because you got in the wrong car. So Mark and I bought him an airline ticket and took him to Omaha and flew him back to California. We felt so helpless. He lost his car on June 27th of 2011. It was in the newspaper. Traffic hazard on Avenida Pico and I-5. A man reportedly sat on the eastbound lanes of Avenida Pico. Ryan Jacob Cook, a 28-year-old waiter, was arrested in connection with the call and booked with bail set at $20,000. I got really used to checking police reports in every county I knew that he could possibly be in. It was a daily thing. I knew when he was in jail and I knew why he was in jail. And guess what? I could sleep. I could sleep when he was in jail. He never once called and said, Mom, bail me out, because he knew that I wouldn't do it. I found the websites at the hospitals where you could find out whether or not any John Does were admitted. I had anticipatory grief. That's when you mourn the loss of somebody who's still alive. I was so afraid that he would die and that they wouldn't find me. He was 2,000 miles away. How could they find me? And during that summer, there was a lot of crazy talk. Psychosis talk from him. He called and he asked, Mom, did you see me on TV? CNN was in the shower with me. He called and he asked, Mom, why are all the rocks in the desert hollow? You always told me in order to have a solid foundation in life, how can I do that when all the rocks are hollow? Do you know the economy collapsed because Ryan owed Capital One $250? Or all the people in white cars are crying, Mom. Why are the people in the white cars crying? And one of them that really was hard was when he called and said, Mom, talk to me. You're the only one that can slow down my heart. Mark and I spent that summer starting out sending him a little bit of grocery money. And we learned really fast, don't do that. Do not send him money. He would do anything and everything to get drugs. So then we decided to pay for an extended stay motel. And when he got really hungry, he would go into a restaurant and he would order a full meal. And then he would call me and ask me to pay for it with a credit card over the phone. And I did it because I knew he wasn't hungry then. and telephones, cell phones, throw them away. He threw away more than one phone that I always replaced because that was my only connection to him. He could figure out how to pay for the service, but when he was in a psychosis, then the cell phone was his enemy and spying on him. He even told me once that when it's shut off, they can still listen. So he has to throw them away. Fortunately for me, Ryan, as a meth addict, was never violent. I know I've heard stories from other moms, other parents, about how violent their meth addicts can be. The worst he did was called me up one time, yelling and swearing that I had to reopen his bank account because I had it closed, which is beyond my power, but I had it closed and I needed to put $7,000 in it. Well, that was another psychosis. I felt so helpless. I prayed day and night for God to fix him. I prayed for God to help him realize that he needed help. I prayed for answers. And finally, I prayed for God to just take him. If God needed him, then please end his suffering and just take him. I planned his funeral over and over and over in my head. Should it be in the cities where all of his friends are? Or should it be in South Dakota, in the church that he was baptized in? I knew he didn't have insurance, so getting into treatment would be hard. He knew we didn't have thousands of dollars to put him into treatment. He wouldn't ask for help. I researched, I talked to counselors here in South Dakota and in California. I relied on information that I remembered from when I attended Al-Anon when I was married to my ex-husband. I knew there were resources if he wanted to get clean. And that was the key, if he wanted to get clean. And then I blamed myself. What did I do wrong? I raised 4 kids. Why did Ryan become an addict? By the fall of 2011, Ryan called again and said, I want to come home. He didn't have a driver's license. He was homeless. He was living on a park bench in Palm Springs, California. All he owned were the clothes on his back. He didn't even have a pair of shoes. I told him, Ryan, I can't fly you home. You don't have an ID. And he had done some research. He learned that Greyhound would give him a bus ticket to get home if I would pay for the ticket, provide them with a question. If he could answer that question, they would give him the ticket. And so he got on a bus, took 3 days to get to South Dakota, but he made it. I met him at the bus depot in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. He scared the daylights out of me. I had no idea who this person was. He had a full beard. I'd never seen my child with a full beard. And he was 6'4" and maybe weighed 120 pounds. I took him home. He spent a couple of days with us, and then he headed to the cities. And he stayed with a very good friend of his from high school. Her name was Kayla, and I believe that she saved his life. She let him simply exist. He cleaned her house, he did her yard work, he painted, he did whatever she asked him to do in exchange for room and board. And he started to clear up, but once again, he's back on the streets, back to using, and back in jail. He called me. They had picked him up November 15th. He told me that they were keeping him in jail for possibly 6 weeks. And I was relieved because then I knew I could sleep again. Well, he did figure out he could ask them to move up the date. They did. And the next thing I knew, he was out. But this time, something changed. Something had clicked. He had court-ordered treatment and 5 years of probation. He cleaned up, got a job, and he managed to stay clean while he was on probation. I was so happy. I had my child back. He was rebuilding his life, his credit, all of it. He was enrolled back in college. Life was good. He didn't talk about the bad times and he didn't talk about treatment. But one thing he did do, and I'm so happy he took the time to do it, is he made me understand that his addiction was not my fault. We had almost 5 really wonderful years when in 2016 he lost his job and fell off the wagon. And Mark and I, by now, we were aware, we knew what to watch for. And once again, he wasn't tracking conversations well. He made sure every time we called and said, oh, we're coming to the cities, coming to visit, he made sure that he looked good and that he was clean and everything was wonderful. But we talked to a few of his friends and they confirmed, yep, he's using again. So we decided instead of letting him know that we were coming, we were just going to drop in. Got in the car, drove to the cities, rang the bell on his apartment complex. He made the mistake of letting us in without asking who was there. Once we knocked on his door, he wouldn't let us in. He met us out at the gazebo, and it was bad again. He was once again he was on his way into the meth-induced psychosis. His friends talked to us, he talked to himself. He kept asking me, Mom, what was there before Adam and Eve? So I knew that things were about to really get bad again. Mark and I got in our car and drove away. There was nothing that we could do. But the surprise of seeing Mom and Dad showing up on his doorstep, I don't know, it seemed like a slap again, because he went and he found another job. We're hoping that it was just a slip. As many addicts do, they slip. He got that job. He became the manager of a bar and grill in Oakdale, Minnesota. And once again, we thought we were going to get our son back. It lasted until the end of 2017. October, November timeframe, he called and said that once again he'd lost his job. The bar was not performing as the management expected, so they let him go. And he said, don't worry, I'll find another job. He had enough money in savings to last for 4 or 5 months. And I always took that as a good thing. I always thought if he's got money, he's not using, right? If he can pay his rent and pay his bills, he's not using. Well, 2018 started out with us knowing that things were getting rough. He didn't want to continue to be a server. He wanted to get a job in technology. He started a new business online. He had a lot of things going on, but nothing was really taking off. And I could tell that he was starting to get depressed. And I offered to come stay with him, but the answer, of course, was no. He offered to build some websites for Mark and I. And so I said, sure, build a couple websites. He was building a server. We could put those websites on a server and not have to pay for hosting. That's when things really went bad. On April 4th of 2018, that morning, Ryan and I were on the phone for at least 90 minutes. He was telling me about these servers he was building. He was explaining to me all the different utilities he was installing on it. He was all there. At 10 o'clock, I told him, Ryan, I have to go. Megan just arrived. I have to get her started on her projects for the day. And so he sent me a text message at 10:15 and he said, don't stress, Mom, I'm fine. That's the last text message I ever received from my son. It's the last time I ever heard his voice. Mark and I were scheduled to leave for the cities that day at 2 o'clock. We had to go pick up signboard for the new sign on the front of our building. So we got in the car and went to the cities. We stayed overnight at Jamie's house. That is our second oldest son. He lives in Hugo. On April 5th, we picked up our signboard. We ran a few other errands, and I texted Ryan and asked if he'd like to meet for breakfast, because that was our thing. He didn't respond, so we left. And we were on our way home. We didn't even make it an hour. We were in Wayzata when we got the call. I didn't recognize the phone number, so I handed my phone to Mark. He answered it, and then he handed it back to me. It was HCMC asking me if I was Ryan Cook's mother. They let me know that they had him in the MICU and that he was unresponsive. And so we turned around. On April 6th, Ryan was still unresponsive. He had myoclonus really bad. His body would constantly jump and his eyes would pop open. And it was really hard to watch. But they told us if they sedated him, that they couldn't continue running tests. See, on the 4th, when he came into the hospital, he collapsed and he went into respiratory failure and he had a heart attack. And so they had cooled down his body and they were warming it back up again and they needed to continue running tests. There were no responses. So they did an MRI and that wasn't good. Most of the slides were white. When we asked if he was brain dead, they said no, there's still some activity, but he's never going to wake up and he will never know who you are and he will never call you mom again. They gently suggested that we remove life support. And I said, okay. Ryan had always said if something happened and he couldn't wipe his own, to let him go. So I said, okay, but not today. I can't do this today. It was too much for today. And so family and friends started to come and say goodbye to Ryan. And they came and they went all through the night. The nurses on that NICU said they had never seen anything like it. On April 7th, 2018 at 2 p.m., they started to disconnect and remove that life support. And at 2:32 p.m., surrounded by family and friends, Ryan took his last breath. The autopsy showed that Ryan died of a massive meth overdose. The police and the medical records show what happened. They tell the story of what happened. Shortly after 10:30 on that morning of 4/4, he was served, or they were going to serve, a search warrant looking for drugs or any evidence of drugs. He left his door unlocked, which allowed the police to walk right in. And when he looked up and saw them, he picked up a shot glass and ingested the contents and then washed it down with Kool-Aid. There was a scuffle. Ryan resisted arrest and they took him down hard. They broke his nose. After he was cuffed, he was taken to an ambulance and taken to HCMC, where he walked in on his own. They noted that he was tremulous. Now there's a discrepancy in the reports as to what happened next. The hospital reports that the officer stepped out of the room and the nurse left the room and came back and found him down 4 minutes later. The police reports show that the officers were asked to uncuff him. And that's when they were informed that he was down. I don't know that it matters what happened in that hospital. He had respiratory failure followed by heart failure. A knee-jerk reaction to hide that evidence. What he knew was going to get him in trouble. And it killed him. If he'd have known the consequences, he would have never done that. I don't know. I don't know if there's anything they could have ever done to save him. Life was so simple before addiction hit our family. We did not understand that addiction is a disease, and we didn't have to understand. Substance abuse disorder. Now that sounds more like a disease than drug addict does. If you go out to the National Institute on Drug Abuse website, They have an explanation out there. Long-term drug use impairs brain functioning. Drugs produce an intense euphoria. They also produce much larger surges of dopamine, which reinforces that connection between the consumption of the drug and the resulting pleasure. You get such large surges of dopamine that you teach your brain to seek those drugs at the expense of everything else in your life. And for the brain, the difference between a normal reward and a drug reward can be likened to somebody whispering to you or somebody yelling into a microphone. That's how much bigger the euphoria is from those drugs. I am an addict's mom, and that doesn't change because he died. I belong to this Facebook group called The Addict's Mom, and our group is over 35,000 moms strong. A lot of us are not professionals in any field of medicine or law enforcement or psychiatric care. The professionals, they're really smart. They know a lot. They know the facts. They know the statistics. And some of them do have some personal experience. But in my group, in this group, us moms, we're really street smart. We see it all and we live it all. We're the front line. We suffer almost as much as our addicts do. We take the brunt of our child's addiction. We're the ones that they call. We're the ones that they manipulate. We watch what addiction does to those children, to our babies. We watch them go from a loving, caring, smart kid into an addict. They go into an addict who is stigmatized by all. They are somebody who makes a mistake and they don't realize the consequences, because we all know from when we grew up, we're invincible and it will never happen to us, right? Our addicts, they might have made the mistake of trusting their doctor or trusting their best friend. How do we know? My son died of a drug overdose, and it wasn't my fault, and I didn't cause it. I tried to fix it, and I couldn't. And there is a horrible stigma around addiction, and it's not just for the addict. There is a stigma around the family too, and the parents. We must have been bad parents. We must have raised our kids wrong. But you know, we had 4 kids and every single one of them turned out differently. Addiction is really, really tough on the whole family, but it's really hard on the mom. We are wired to fix our kids. We are wired to help them, to save them. Our addicted children, they take over our lives. They require more attention than our non-addicted children. And addiction can go on for years. We invest so much in our addicted children that we often lose ourselves. We have to learn how to support them without enabling them. And we have to learn what the boundaries are and where the boundaries are. And we have to make sure we can live with those boundaries, because if they die, if the worst thing happens, you need to minimize your guilt, because those what ifs, they're going to haunt you. Ryan was very, very successful. He was an assistant manager at a bank branch. He was a top server in a national chain restaurant. He became a manager at a bar and grill. He had a real estate license in the state of California. He was a technology whiz. He could build computers. He started an online business. He was smart and funny, and everybody loved him. And he became a drug addict. It can happen to anyone. 2 months before my Ryan died, My sister Dawn lost her husband to cancer. Now, everybody probably heard about the coach from Waverly, South Dakota, the basketball coach that died. That was my brother-in-law, Ryan Gross. Dawn and I went to the cemetery to look at the family plot we had purchased when her Ryan died. And I told her, I said, I'm really scared we're going to bury both the Ryans first. So now we're both grieving. We're grieving, but it's not the same. When a friend dies, it's hard. When you lose a parent, it's painful. It's hard. You don't want to lose your parents, but it's the natural order of things. You expect to lose your parents. If your spouse passes away, that can be devastating because that spouse may have been your soulmate. That spouse may have been your very best friend in life. And you might never love somebody like that again. But you know what? You know that there's an opportunity that you might find somebody again. But when you lose a child, there's nothing that can compare to the pain and devastation of losing a child. So now I need to ask, if you're talking to somebody who is grieving and they're grieving really hard, do you know what to say? Do you have any idea what to say to that person that is grieving? Because if they open up and they tell you how they are truly, truly feeling, can you handle that? How do you stay engaged talking to somebody who has experienced a loss that might be the greatest fear of your life? Losing someone you love or losing your own child. And you don't even want to think about it. You don't want to have somebody tell you how it feels. So maybe when you see them, you don't even have the conversation. Or maybe you begin to avoid the person so that you don't have the conversation. And how does that make the person who is grieving feel? Well, I can tell you, it makes you feel alone. It makes you feel like nobody cares, like you're losing even more than just the child that you've lost. It makes you feel like you're losing everybody. Telling somebody, and I've had a lot of people tell me this, oh, you are so strong. That's not the right thing to say to somebody that's grieving, because now you have effectively shut that person down, because how can they tell you honestly how they feel and how they're grieving if they have to be strong for you? How can they open up about how much they hurt or how much they hate their new normal? We didn't want this. We're not strong. Sometimes we wonder how we're going to get through the next day. Sometimes we don't even want to wake up for the next day. And that doesn't mean that we want to hurt ourselves. We don't want to hurt ourselves. We don't want to put somebody else through that kind of pain. But sometimes it just hurts so much you just don't want to hurt anymore. And unless you've lost a child, you can't really know. And our new normal is living without a piece of our heart. You have to learn how to reinvest into your life. How to learn how to survive with this new normal. I mentioned before that I am a member of this group called the Addict's Mom, and I was a member long before Ryan passed away. And there are over 35,000 moms in this group, and it's a Facebook group, and we share our experiences and our pain, the frustrations that our addicts put us through, or even our recovering addicts put us through. And I thank God for that group, because that group saved my life. You can't talk about addiction to just anybody. And I started journaling. I started blogging with this group when I got the call. These moms allowed me to blog and journal my pain and raised me up every day for 500 days. The first 500 days, I wrote every night how I was feeling. And I don't know what I would have done without them. I went to a grief group at the local hospital. It wasn't for me. I just didn't click with the few people that were there. And living in a small community, you don't have a lot of resources. I bought every single book there was that I could find on grief, and I read them. And I went to my doctor, and if you're grieving, go to your doctor. You don't need to be worried about health when you're grieving, and you will worry about your own health. They offered to help me, to give me medication to deal with my grief, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't take anything. I had to do it on my own because drugs are what killed my son, and so I needed to do it without any pills. So even though Ryan lost his battle with the demons in his life, Mark and I have worked on ways for us to continue forward and carry forward the message of where there is life, there is hope. We've started a website. It's called The Addict's Hope. And we tell Ryan's story on this website. It's our goal to help educate the community on the effects of addiction, on what addiction does to your family, and the loss from addiction, how that affects your whole family. We want to help people that are struggling with addiction, and most important, we want them to know that they are worth saving. We want them to know that they're important and that they're loved. We want them to know that where there is life, there is hope. And thank you for letting me share Ryan's story.
Thank you, Beth.
Mm-hmm.
Does anybody, do you want to take some questions, or anyone want to share?
Deep breath. Yes, I can take questions.
Anyone want to ask Beth a question or make any comments or any sharing?
It's a tough topic. It really, really is.
Well, I just want to say, having worked with people with substance use disorder, that, you know, you talk about the stigma, and there is certainly a stigma. And I think the clients that I work with also feel that same stigma. I mean, it comes in shame, and they can't forgive themselves for the things they've done, and they don't see it as a disease either.
Mm-hmm.
So I thank you for sharing your story. I've seen the things that you talk about, and obviously I haven't experienced them. So, I hope that those of us in the treatment community and those of us in the criminal justice community can do what we can to try to change how we look at this disease and change how we react to it. And just thank you very much for your story.
Anyone else? I see people are making comments in the chat, and we appreciate you sharing your story, Beth, and your journey and your hope. And that's what it's about, hearing from people's experiences, knowing how we can be helpful to those, understanding that grief, and everybody grieves differently, but also, but also knowing that there's a lot of supports out there, and that communication is key. And I think people realizing that it is a disease and there's different strategies and different ways of dealing with that. So again, thank you.
Thank you for having me, Kelly.
You bet.
Thank you, Beth. For someone who works with youth, I am a chemical dependency counselor and I work at a high school. But just as importantly, I have addiction in our family as well. And so, it takes courage and everything that you've got to address this. I just want you to know you are making a difference.
Oh, I hope so.
Thank you.
Mhm.